After dedicating 25 years of my life to Wellington Financial, I never expected to be called into HR on a Tuesday morning to be told my position was being restructured. But what my boss, Richard Miller, didn't realize was that on page 37 of my original employment contract, there was a clause he should have read more carefully, very carefully. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other. I arrived at Wellington Financial's headquarters in downtown Philadelphia at 7:15 a.m., just like I had for the past 25 years. The security guard, Frank, nodded as I scanned my badge. "Morning, Thomas," he said with the same easy smile he'd given me for the last decade. I had no idea it would be one of the last times I'd hear that greeting. "My name is Thomas Greene, 57 years old, and until that Tuesday, I was the Senior Risk Assessment Manager at Wellington Financial, one of the largest regional financial services firms in the Northeast. I'd started when we occupied just half a floor in a modest office building. Now, our logo crowned a 30-story tower that dominated the skyline. I'd been there through 3 recessions, 2 major acquisitions, and the entire digital transformation of our industry. I settled at my desk, the same one I'd used for the last 15 years, positioned perfectly to see both my team and the sweeping view of the Delaware River. My coffee mug, a chipped relic from our 10-year anniversary celebration, sat next to a framed photo of my wife, Linda, and our 2 daughters on their college graduation days. 20 minutes into reviewing the quarterly risk assessment reports, my desk phone rang. "Thomas, can you come to my office? Bring your keycard." Richard's voice sounded strained, unusual for our normally smooth-talking COO. "Sure thing, B." "Right there," I replied, already sensing something was off. Richard Miller had been my boss for only 3 years, brought in during the latest reorganization. He was 41, MBA from Wharton, slick presentation style, but limited actual experience in our industry. The kind of executive who used terms like synergy and disruptive innovation, while rarely understanding the day-to-day operations that kept our company profitable. As I approached his corner office, I noticed Heather Jenkins from HR sitting primly in one of the guest chairs. Her expression was carefully neutral. The third person in the room I didn't recognize at first. A young man, maybe 30, wearing a suit that likely cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Something about his features looked vaguely familiar. "Thomas, please have a seat." Richard gestured to the remaining chair. "I'll get right to the point. As part of our strategic realignment, we're making some changes to the risk assessment department." I nodded, waiting for him to continue, though I already knew what was coming. The corporate euphemisms were all too familiar after 25 years in the business. "After careful consideration, we've decided to eliminate your current position," Richard continued, not quite meeting my eyes. "We're moving toward a more agile approach to risk assessment, focusing on digital solutions and automated reporting systems." Heather slid a folder across the table. "This outlines your severance package, 2 months' salary, continuation of benefits for 60 days, and of course, your pension remains intact." 2 months. After 25 years. I felt my face flush, but kept my expression neutral as I opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. "I'd like to introduce you to Michael Sawyer," Richard said, gesturing to the young man. "He'll be heading up the new Risk Innovation Division, which will absorb your team's responsibilities." Michael extended his hand, a practiced smile on his face. "It's a pleasure, Thomas. I've heard great things about your work." That's when it clicked, the resemblance. The same slightly crooked smile as Richard's sister, whose photos dotted his office. This was Richard's nephew, the one he occasionally mentioned was doing amazing things in fintech in Boston. "When will this transition take place?" I asked, my voice steady despite the thundering in my chest. Effective immediately, Richard replied. Heather will accompany you to clear out your personal belongings. We'll need your key card, company phone, and laptop before you leave the building. I nodded once, closed the folder, and stood up. 25 years reduced to a 10-minute conversation and a cardboard box for my belongings. No celebration of my contributions, no transition period, not even a genuine thank you. Just corporate machinery grinding forward, discarding what it no longer valued. I understand, was all I said. As Heather led me back to my desk, whispers rippled through the open office. News travels fast, especially bad news. My team looked up with confused expressions as I began emptying my drawers into the box Heather had brought. Sarah, my deputy for the last 8 years, approached cautiously. "Thomas? What's happening?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Restructuring," I replied quietly. "You'll be reporting to Michael Sawyer now. He's Richard's nephew. New division, new direction." Her eyes widened in understanding, then narrowed in anger. "This is ridiculous. Nobody knows our systems like you do. The Harriman account alone—" I shook my head slightly, cutting her off. Now wasn't the time. Heather was watching, and I had no intention of making a scene. Throughout my career, I'd prided myself on professionalism. That wouldn't change, even. At the end, "It'll be fine, Sarah," I said, though we both knew it wouldn't be. "The team is in good hands with you." 45 minutes later, I walked through the lobby for the last time. My possessions in a box, my access card surrendered. Frank looked confused as I passed his security desk without scanning in. "You heading out early, Mr. Greene?" "Something like that, Frank. Take care of yourself." In my car, I sat motionless, staring at the building where I'd spent half my life. The sudden silence was disorienting. No emails demanding responses, no meetings to prepare for, no junior staff seeking guidance. Just the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the weight of uncertainty. I drove home slowly, trying to process what had happened. Linda wouldn't be home for hours. She was teaching her third-grade class. Our house was empty, unnervingly quiet. As I set the box down on our kitchen table, I made coffee out of habit, then stood by the window, watching the neighbor's cat prowl across our backyard. That's when I remembered it. Not in a flash of inspiration, but gradually, like a photo developing. My original employment contract, signed 25 years ago when Wellington was still Wellington and Associates, a much smaller firm with different leadership and different values. I'd kept a copy, of course. I keep everything. Linda calls it a quirk. I call it prudence. In our home office, I unlocked the filing cabinet where I kept important documents. Birth certificates, property deeds, insurance policies, and employment records, all meticulously organized. I pulled out the expandable folder labeled Wellington Employment and began searching through the papers. There it was, my original contract, yellowed slightly at the edges, bearing signatures that belonged to people long retired or gone. I started reading, page by page, searching for something, anything that might matter now. On page 37, under Additional Terms and Provisions, I found it. Clause 15C. In the event of involuntary termination following 20 or more years of continuous employment, excluding termination for cause, employee shall be entitled to severance compensation equal to 1 month's current salary. For each year of service, continuation of health benefits for a period equal to the severance term, and retention of all accumulated unused vacation and personal time as additional compensation. I read it 3 times to be sure. 1 month for each year of service, 25 months, not 2. The contract had never been superseded. I'd checked each time the company reorganized, and my original terms remained in force with addendums for salary increases and position changes. Richard wouldn't know about this clause. He hadn't been with the company when these contracts were standard. The current HR team likely hadn't reviewed the original document either, assuming the standard severance package applied to everyone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In their rush to install Richard's nephew, they'd overlooked something critical. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not vindication, not yet, but the quiet certainty that comes with holding an ace you didn't know was in your hand. I made a copy of the contract, then carefully returned the original to its folder. Tomorrow would be soon enough to address this. Tonight, I needed to tell my wife that after 25 years, I no longer had a job. When Linda came home, her reaction surprised me. After the initial shock and outrage. They did what? To make room for his nephew? She grew thoughtful. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise, Tom, she said, as we sat on our back porch, watching the sunset with glasses of wine. You've been talking about consulting for years. Remember how Paul Jennings tried to recruit you to his firm last year? You've got an incredible network. This might be your chance to work on your own terms. I hadn't thought about it that way. For so long, my identity had been tied to Wellington that imagining a professional life outside its walls seemed almost impossible. But Linda was right. I did have options, connections built over decades in the industry. There's something else, I said, showing her Clause 15C. They're shorting me on severance significantly. Her eyes widened as she read it. 25 months instead of 2? That's life-changing, Tom. What are you going to do? I considered the question carefully. My first instinct wasn't to storm back into the office, demanding justice. That wasn't my style. My strength had always been in careful analysis, in understanding systems and finding leverage points. I'm going to approach this methodically, I said finally. I need to understand exactly what happened and why. Richard may have wanted to bring in his nephew, but there's more to this story than simple nepotism. That night, I couldn't sleep. While Linda dozed beside me, I sat up with my laptop, accessing my personal email. Over the years, I'd forwarded myself key documents and communications, not company secrets, but information relevant to my work, that I sometimes needed to reference from home, all perfectly allowable under Wellington's policies. Among these emails were the last 3 quarterly forecasts I'd prepared, warning about risk exposure in a new investment product the company had launched, the Meridian Fund. The product had been Richard's pet project, heavily promoted to our high-net-worth clients. My analysis showed potential regulatory compliance issues and liquidity concerns, especially if market conditions shifted. Richard had dismissed my warnings as overly cautious and resistant to innovation. I also found emails from Sarah sent just last month, flagging unusual transaction patterns in the Meridian Fund that didn't align with our standard risk metrics. I'd escalated these concerns to Richard, who assured me they were being addressed. Now I wondered if they had been addressed by removing me. By morning, I had a clearer picture. I wasn't fired just to make room for Richard's nephew. I was fired because I was asking uncomfortable questions about the Meridian Fund, questions that might have eventually required answers Richard didn't want to give. Michael wasn't just a convenient replacement. He was a pliant one, unlikely to challenge his uncle's decisions. With this realization, my approach shifted. This wasn't just about severance now. It was about potential misconduct that could harm our clients and the company I'd helped build for 25 years. I spent the next day gathering information. I called Sarah from my personal phone, careful to keep the conversation general. "How's the transition going?" I asked after exchanging pleasantries. "It's challenging," she replied cautiously. "Michael doesn't understand our systems or processes. He's implementing new reporting standards that bypass some of our critical risk checkpoints. And the Meridian Fund? Any updates there?" A pause. Thomas, I don't feel comfortable discussing that. There have been some directives about information security since you left. Interesting. I understand, Sarah. Take care of yourself. Next, I called Martin Webber, a colleague who'd retired from Wellington's legal department 2 years ago. We met for lunch at a small restaurant far from the financial district. Not surprised they pushed you out, Martin said, after I explained the situation. Richard's been consolidating power since he arrived. Anyone who doesn't support his vision gets sidelined or exits. What about the contract clause? I asked, sliding him a copy. Martin studied it, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise. This is rock solid, Thomas. The language is unambiguous. They owe you a lot more than what they offered. And if I push back, they'll initially resist, claim the clause is no longer applicable due to subsequent policy changes. But that won't hold up. Your original contract remains binding unless explicitly superseded, which you say it wasn't. What about the Meridian Fund concerns? Martin's expression turned serious. That's trickier. If there are compliance issues, as a former employee, you have limited protection if you disclose them. But, he added, as part of severance negotiations, you could ensure those concerns are properly addressed without directly making accusations. I nodded, formulating a plan. I need one more piece of information before I make my move. That piece came from David Chen, Wellington's chief compliance officer, who I'd known for 15 years. We belonged to the same golf club, and I coincidentally ran into him that weekend. Horrible what happened to you, David said as we walked between holes. Bad form, especially after all your years of service. These things happen, I replied, neutrally. I'm more concerned about some unresolved issues with the Meridian Fund. There were some compliance flags in my last review that needed further investigation. David's swing faltered, sending his ball into the rough. Yes, well, those concerns are being addressed. By Michael Sawyer? A grimace. He's taking a different approach to risk assessment. More forward-looking, less concerned with regulatory minutiae. Regulatory minutiae like proper disclosures and reserve requirements? David didn't answer directly, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. The Meridian Fund issues weren't being addressed. They were being buried. Monday. Morning, exactly 1 week after my termination, I sent a carefully worded email to Richard Miller, Heather Jenkins, and the company's general counsel, Elizabeth Wong. Upon review of my original employment contract with Wellington Financial, attached, I've identified a discrepancy in the severance package presented to me. According to clause 15C, I am entitled to 25 months of severance pay, not the 2 months offered. I would appreciate this matter being rectified promptly. Additionally, I have concerns regarding risk assessment practices currently being implemented for the Meridian Fund, which may potentially expose the company to regulatory scrutiny. I would be willing to discuss both matters in person at your earliest convenience. I didn't explicitly threaten or accuse. I simply stated facts and offered an opportunity for discussion. The response was swift. Within an hour, Elizabeth Wong called me personally. Mr. Greene, I've reviewed the contract you provided. You appear to be correct regarding the severance terms. I'm not sure how this oversight occurred, but we'll need to meet to discuss this matter further. And the Meridian Fund concerns? A slight hesitation. That would be best addressed in person as well. Could you come to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m.? I'd prefer a neutral location, I replied. The Capitol Hotel lobby at 10 a.m. would work. For me. Another pause. Very well, Richard Miller will join us. The following morning, I arrived at the Capitol Hotel 15 minutes early, taking a seat with a clear view of the entrance. I dressed in my best suit, not for intimidation, but out of respect for the institution I'd served for 25 years. Beside me was a leather portfolio containing key documents, my contract, printed emails about the Meridian Fund concerns, and a letter from Martin outlining my legal position. Richard and Elizabeth arrived together, both looking tense. Richard's usual confident stride was missing as they approached. "Thomas," Elizabeth began after brief greetings, "we've reviewed your contract thoroughly. You're correct about Clause 15C. It was an unfortunate oversight in preparing your severance package. These older contracts have certain provisions that differ from our current standards," Richard added, attempting to sound authoritative. "We're prepared to honor the terms, of course." "I appreciate that," I replied evenly. "And the Meridian Fund?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure what specific concerns you're referring to. The compliance issues I raised in my last 3 quarterly reports," I interrupted quietly. "The unusual transaction patterns Sarah Matthews identified last month. The liquidity concerns that were dismissed as overly cautious." Elizabeth glanced sharply at Richard. Clearly, she hadn't been fully briefed on these details. "Thomas," Richard said, his voice lowered, "business decisions sometimes require calculated risks. The Meridian Fund is performing well within acceptable parameters." "Is it?" I removed a document from my portfolio, a printout of the fund's actual performance metrics compared to what had been reported to clients. "Because these numbers suggest otherwise." Elizabeth took the paper, studying it with growing concern. "Where did you get this?" "From reports I legally had access to as part of my job," I replied. "Reports that highlight discrepancies that any regulatory audit would immediately flag." Richard's face had gone pale. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that as Senior Risk Assessment Manager, I identified serious concerns that were ignored. Shortly after escalating those concerns, I was terminated and replaced by someone with limited experience who happens to be related to you. These are facts, not implications." Elizabeth set the document down. "What is it you want, Mr. Greene?" It was the question I'd been waiting for. 3 things. First, full compliance with my contract's severance terms. Second, an independent audit of the Meridian Fund, with full disclosure to clients if issues are identified. Third, Sarah Matthews, to be promoted to Deputy Director of Risk Assessment, with the authority to implement proper oversight protocols. "That's," Richard began. "Reasonable," Elizabeth cut in, giving Richard a warning look. "Given the circumstances, very reasonable." Now Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. "We'll need to discuss this internally." "Of course," I agreed. "I should mention that I've prepared a detailed memo regarding my concerns. If we can't reach an agreement, I'll feel ethically obligated to share it with the Board of Directors and the appropriate regulatory bodies. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact. In my 25 years at Wellington, I'd built a reputation for integrity. That hadn't changed because I no longer had an office in their building. 2 days later, I received a call from Elizabeth. "The board has approved all 3 of your requests," she said. "The paperwork for your revised severance will be ready tomorrow. The independent audit of the Meridian Fund begins next week, and Sarah Matthews has accepted the Deputy Director position, effective immediately. And Richard?" I couldn't help asking. A slight pause. "Mr. Miller is taking a leave of absence pending the audit results." I thanked her and hung up, feeling a complex mix of emotions. No triumph or vindication. That wasn't what I'd sought. Instead, there was relief that the company I'd helped build wouldn't be damaged by poor decisions, that clients wouldn't lose money due to mismanagement, and that someone deserving would have the authority to prevent similar situations in the future. 3 weeks later, the first installment of my proper severance arrived, enough to give Linda and me considerable financial security while I explored my next chapter. The independent audit identified significant issues with the Meridian Fund, which were promptly addressed before any client suffered losses. Richard Miller quietly resigned. His nephew remained at Wellington, but was reassigned to a position more aligned with his actual experience. As for me, I did eventually start that consulting business Linda had suggested. My first client? Wellington Financial, which retained me to review their legacy contracts and compliance systems. The board chair called personally to request my services. "We need someone who truly understands our systems," she said. "Someone who puts integrity above personal gain." Sometimes being underestimated is actually an advantage. They saw a 57-year-old manager they could easily replace. They didn't see someone who understood the value of documentation, who knew every corner of the business they thought they could reshape without consequences. The irony wasn't lost on me. In pushing me out, Richard had actually secured my financial future and opened a new career path I might never have taken otherwise. And that contract clause he overlooked? It wasn't just about money. It was about respect for commitments made, promises kept, and the understanding that genuine value doesn't depreciate simply because someone no longer sees it. 25 years taught me that systems only work when they're built on integrity. When that fails, the whole structure eventually collapses. I didn't need to push it over. I just needed to show where the cracks were forming, then step aside. Now, when junior consultants ask me for career advice, I tell them, keep copies of everything, read the fine print, and remember that your value isn't determined by a title or an office. It's built day by day in every decision you make when no one's watching. That, and always be the person who reads page 37 of the contract. You never know what you might find there. As Heather led me back to my desk, whispers rippled through the open office. News travels fast, especially bad news. My team looked up with confused expressions as I began emptying my drawers into the box Heather had brought. Sarah, my deputy for the last 8 years, approached cautiously. "Thomas, what's happening?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Restructuring," I replied quietly. "You'll be reporting to Michael Sawyer now. He's Richard's nephew. New division, new direction." Her eyes widened in understanding, then narrowed in anger. "This is ridiculous. Nobody knows our systems like you do. The Harriman account alone." I shook my head slightly, cutting her off. Now wasn't the time. Heather was watching, and I had no intention of making a scene. Throughout my career, I'd prided myself on professionalism. That wouldn't change even. At the end, "It'll be fine, Sarah," I said, though we both knew it wouldn't be. "The team is in good hands with you." 45 minutes later, I walked through the lobby for the last time, my possessions in a box, my access card surrendered. Frank looked confused as I passed his security desk without scanning in. "You heading out early, Mr. Greene?" "Something like that, Frank. Take care of yourself." In my car, I sat motionless, staring at the building where I'd spent half my life. The sudden silence was disorienting. No emails demanding responses, no meetings to prepare for, no junior staff seeking guidance. Just the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the weight of uncertainty. I drove home slowly, trying to process what had happened. Linda wouldn't be home for hours. She was teaching her third-grade class. Our house was empty, unnervingly quiet. As I set the box down on our kitchen table, I made coffee out of habit, then stood by the window, watching the neighbor's cat prowl across our backyard. That's when I remembered it. Not in a flash of inspiration, but gradually, like a photo developing. My original employment contract, signed 25 years ago when Wellington was still Wellington and Associates, a much smaller firm with different leadership and different values. I'd kept a copy, of course. I keep everything. Linda calls it a quirk. I call it prudence. In our home office, I unlocked the filing cabinet where I kept important documents, birth certificates, property deeds, insurance policies, and employment records, all meticulously organized. I pulled out the expandable folder labeled Wellington Employment and began searching through the papers. There it was, my original contract, yellowed slightly at the edges, bearing signatures that belonged to people long retired or gone. I started reading, page by page, searching for something, anything that might matter now. On page 37, under Additional Terms and Provisions, I found it. Clause 15C. In the event of involuntary termination following 20 or more years of continuous employment, excluding termination for cause, employee shall be entitled to severance compensation equal to one month's current salary for each year of service, continuation of health benefits for a period equal to the severance term, and retention of all accumulated unused vacation and personal time as additional compensation. I read it 3 times to be sure. 1 month for each year of service, 25 months, not 2. The contract had never been superseded. I checked each time the company reorganized, and my original terms remained in force with addendums for salary increases and position changes. Richard wouldn't know about this clause. He hadn't been with the company when these contracts were standard. The current HR team likely hadn't reviewed the original document either, assuming the standard severance package applied to everyone. In their rush to install Richard's nephew, they'd overlooked something critical. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not vindication, not yet, but the quiet certainty that comes with holding an ace you didn't know was in your hand. I made a copy of the contract, then carefully returned the original to its folder. Tomorrow would be soon enough to address this. Tonight, I needed to tell my wife that after 25 years, I no longer had a job. When Linda came home, her reaction surprised me. After the initial shock and outrage, they did what to make room for his nephew? She grew thoughtful. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise, Tom, she said as we sat on our back porch, watching the sunset with glasses of wine. You've been talking about consulting for years. Remember how Paul Jennings tried to recruit you to his firm last year? You've got an incredible network. This might be your chance to work on your own terms. I hadn't thought about it that way. For so long, my identity had been tied to Wellington that imagining a professional life outside its walls seemed almost impossible. But Linda was right. I did have options, connections built over decades in the industry. There's something else, I said, showing her clause 15C. They're shorting me on severance, significantly. Her eyes widened as she read it. 25 months instead of 2, that's life-changing, Tom. What are you going to do? I considered the question carefully. My first instinct wasn't to storm back into the office demanding justice. That wasn't my style. My strength had always been in careful analysis, in understanding systems and finding leverage points. I'm going to approach this methodically, I said, finally. I need to understand exactly what happened and why. Richard may have wanted to bring in his nephew, but there's more to this story than simple nepotism. That night I couldn't sleep. While Linda dozed beside me, I sat up with my laptop, accessing my personal email. Over the years, I'd forwarded myself key documents and communications, not company secrets, but information relevant to my work, that I sometimes needed to reference from home. All perfectly allowable under Wellington's policies. Among these emails were the last 3 quarterly forecasts I'd prepared, warning about risk exposure in a new investment product the company had launched, the Meridian Fund. The product had been Richard's pet project, heavily promoted to our high-net-worth clients. My analysis showed potential regulatory compliance issues and liquidity concerns, especially if market conditions shifted. Richard had dismissed my warnings as overly cautious and resistant to innovation. I also found emails from Sarah sent just last month, flagging unusual transaction patterns in the Meridian Fund that didn't align with our standard risk metrics. I'd escalated these concerns to Richard, who assured me they were being addressed. Now I wondered if they had been addressed. By removing me. By morning I had a clearer picture. I wasn't fired just to make room for Richard's nephew. I was fired because I was asking uncomfortable questions about the Meridian Fund. questions that might have eventually required answers Richard didn't want to give. Michael wasn't just a convenient replacement, he was a pliant one, unlikely to challenge his uncle's decisions. With this realization, my approach shifted. This wasn't just about severance now, it was about potential misconduct that could harm our clients and the company I'd helped build for 25 years. I spent the next day gathering information. I called Sarah from my personal phone, careful to keep the conversation general. "How's the transition going?" I asked, after exchanging pleasantries. "It's challenging," she replied cautiously. "Michael doesn't understand our systems or processes. He's implementing new reporting standards that bypass some of our critical risk checkpoints." "And the Meridian Fund? Any updates there?" A pause. "Thomas, I don't feel comfortable discussing that. There have been some directives about information security since you left." "Interesting." "I understand, Sarah. Take care of yourself." Next, I called Martin Webber, a colleague who'd retired from Wellington's legal department 2 years ago. We met for lunch at a small restaurant far from the financial district. "Not surprised they pushed you out," Martin said, after I explained the situation. "Richard's been consolidating power since he arrived. Anyone who doesn't support his vision gets sidelined or exits." "What about the contract clause?" I asked, sliding him a copy. Martin studied it, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise. "This is rock solid, Thomas. The language is unambiguous. They owe you a lot more than what they offered. And if I push back? They'll initially resist, claim the clause is no longer applicable due to subsequent policy changes. But that won't hold up. Your original contract remains binding unless explicitly superseded, which you say it wasn't. What about the Meridian Fund concerns?" Martin's expression turned serious. "That's trickier. If there are compliance issues as a former employee, you have limited protection if you disclose them. But," he added, "as part of severance negotiations, you could ensure those concerns are properly addressed without directly making accusations." I nodded, formulating a plan. "I need one more piece of information before I make my move." That piece came from David Chen, Wellington's chief compliance officer, who I'd known for 15 years. We belonged to the same golf club, and I, coincidentally, ran into him that weekend. "Horrible what happened to you," David said as we walked between holes. "Bad form, especially after all your years of service." "These things happen," I replied neutrally. "I'm more concerned about some unresolved issues with the Meridian Fund. There were some compliance flags in my last review that needed further investigation." David's swing faltered, sending his ball into the rough. "Yes, well, those concerns are being addressed." "By Michael Sawyer?" A grimace. "He's taking a different approach to risk assessment. More forward-looking, less concerned with regulatory minutiae." "Regulatory minutiae like proper disclosures and reserve requirements?" David didn't answer directly, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. The Meridian Fund issues weren't being addressed, they were being buried. My suspicions deepened when I ran into Elaine Porter at the grocery store later that day. Elaine was Wellington's controller, responsible for account reconciliation and financial reporting. We'd worked together on numerous occasions, most recently when I flagged inconsistencies in the Meridian Fund's reported returns. "Thomas, I heard—" "What happened?" she said, her voice lowered though we were alone in the produce section. "It's shameful how they handled it." I thanked her for her concern, then carefully steered the conversation. "I'm adjusting to retirement, though I do wonder how those Meridian Fund discrepancies resolved, the ones we discussed last month." Elaine's gaze darted around, checking if anyone was within earshot. "They didn't. Michael approved the reports, without addressing your flags. When I questioned it, Richard told me it wasn't my department's concern." What about the third quarter projections, the ones showing potential liquidity shortfalls? Revised, completely new methodology that conveniently eliminates the problem areas you identified. She squeezed my arm. I'm considering an early retirement myself. The atmosphere has changed. This was worse than I'd thought. Not just sidelining concerns, but potentially falsifying projections to hide risks. I thanked Elaine and quickly finished my shopping, my mind racing. At home, I pulled out my notes on the Meridian Fund from my personal files. For the past 18 months, I documented every red flag, every unusual pattern, every instance where Richard had dismissed legitimate concerns. Viewing them chronologically revealed a disturbing progression. The fund had started conservatively, investing primarily in established sectors with predictable returns. But over time, particularly in the last 9 months, it had shifted toward increasingly speculative investments. The risk profile had changed dramatically, yet client disclosures hadn't been updated to reflect this. Worse, the reported returns seemed inconsistent with the actual investments, too stable, too predictable, given the volatile nature of the newer holdings. Most concerning was a series of investments in privately held companies that had minimal financial transparency. 3 of these companies shared a common address, a small office building in Wilmington, Delaware. A quick internet search revealed they were all registered to the same agent with no clear information about ownership or operations. I dug deeper, cross-referencing names and dates, and discovered something even more troubling. One of the managing partners in these companies was listed as James Miller, Richard's brother. The Meridian Fund had invested over $35 million in businesses connected to the Miller family, with no disclosure of this relationship to clients or, it seemed, to Wellington's board. The pieces were falling into place. Richard hadn't just fired me to make room for his nephew. He'd removed me because I was getting too close to uncovering what appeared to be self-dealing on a massive scale. By installing Michael, he ensured the risk assessment department would overlook these connections. This changed everything. What I'd initially seen as a personal injustice now looked like potential fraud that could devastate our clients and the company itself. Wellington managed retirement funds for thousands of people, college savings for families, investments for small businesses. If the Meridian Fund collapsed due to undisclosed risks and conflicts of interest, the damage would be immeasurable. I sat back, feeling the weight of this knowledge. I had a choice to make. I could focus solely on my severance claim, get what I was legally owed, and walk away. Or I could use that claim as leverage to address the larger issues, potentially protecting clients and colleagues from significant harm. The decision wasn't difficult. Wellington wasn't just where I'd worked, it represented a quarter-century of my professional life. I'd helped build systems designed to protect clients from exactly this kind of risk. I couldn't walk away knowing what I now knew. I needed more concrete evidence before proceeding. Suspicions and patterns weren't enough. I needed documentation that clearly showed the connections and conflicts of interest. Fortunately, I still had one more source. Rebecca Winters had been my administrative assistant for 7 years before being reassigned to executive support 3 months ago, specifically to Richard and Michael's team. We'd remained friendly, occasionally meeting for coffee. I sent her a text asking if she was free the next morning. We met at a small cafe 2 miles from Wellington's offices. Rebecca looked nervous, continuously checking her phone. "I can't stay long," she said after ordering. "Things are chaotic since you left. Everyone's working overtime to prepare for the quarterly board meeting next week." "I appreciate you making time," I said. "How's working with the executive team?" She grimaced. "Different, very different. Richard has me handling all sorts of personal matters. Making dinner reservations, booking flights for his family. Yesterday, I had to help Michael's girlfriend find an apartment near the office." "Sounds like you've become more of a personal assistant than an administrative one." That's not even the half of it. She lowered her voice. Last week, Richard had me prepare materials for a meeting with investors from the Meridian Fund. The projections he wanted included were nothing like the ones from your department. When I mentioned the discrepancy, he said the old numbers were unnecessarily conservative and to use his version. Do you still have access to those materials? She hesitated. Thomas, I don't want to get involved in something that could cost me my job. I understand, I assured her, but I'm concerned about potential regulatory violations that could hurt a lot of people, including Wellington's clients and employees. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal or unethical. Rebecca sighed, then reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. I made copies of some documents that didn't seem right. The originals are on the company server, but these show what's being presented to clients versus the actual internal assessments. I glanced at the contents, exactly what I needed. Side-by-side comparisons showing dramatically different risk assessments for the same investments. Client-facing materials omitting key related party disclosures, meeting minutes showing Richard explicitly directing changes to risk metrics. Thank you, Rebecca. This won't come back to you, I promise. She nodded, standing to leave. I should get back, just be careful, Thomas. Richard's been acting strangely since you left, paranoid, checking who's accessing which files. He had IT revoke several people's permissions, including mine for certain documents. After she left, I carefully reviewed everything. The evidence was damning. Not only were Richard and his brother potentially enriching themselves through Wellington's investments, but they were actively misrepresenting risks to clients and the board. And now they were covering their tracks, limiting access to information that might expose them. With Rebecca's documents, my own records, and the information from Elaine and David, I had enough to act. But I needed to be strategic, going directly. To regulators might protect clients, but would likely damage Wellington irreparably. Hundreds would lose their jobs, including many good people who had no knowledge of these activities. Instead, I decided to approach Elizabeth Wong, Wellington's general counsel. I'd worked with her for nearly a decade and knew her to be principled and independent, someone who took her fiduciary responsibilities seriously. If presented with clear evidence, she would be legally obligated to act, regardless of her relationship with Richard. Before contacting her, I organized everything into a comprehensive package. Timeline of events, documentation of the Meridian Fund's evolution, evidence of the Miller family connections, side-by-side comparisons of disclosed versus actual risk profiles, and of course, my severance claim under Clause 15C. I then wrote a careful, measured email to Elizabeth requesting a confidential meeting to discuss contractual matters related to my termination and potential compliance concerns regarding the Meridian Fund. I was deliberately vague about specifics, knowing that putting too much in writing might trigger defensive reactions before I could present the full picture. Elizabeth responded within an hour, agreeing to meet the following day at her home, a neutral location away from Wellington's offices. Her choice of venue suggested she understood the sensitivity of what I might share. That evening, I briefed Linda on everything I'd discovered. As a former compliance officer for a different financial institution before becoming a teacher, she immediately grasped the implications. "This is serious, Tom," she said, reviewing the documents. "If regulators discover this pattern, particularly the related party transactions, without proper disclosure, there could be criminal charges." "I know. That's why I'm approaching Elizabeth first. She has the authority and obligation to address it internally before it reaches that point." Linda studied me, concern evident in her expression. "Just be careful. People who've been hiding something this significant won't go down without a fight." "I'm not looking for a fight," I assured her, "just resolution. For myself, for the clients, and for Wellington." And if Elizabeth doesn't act appropriately? Then I have other options, but I believe she will. She has too much to lose professionally if she ignores documented evidence of potential fraud. The next morning, I drove to Elizabeth's home in the suburbs, a colonial-style house on a quiet street lined with mature oaks. She greeted me at the door, her expression guarded, but not unfriendly. "Thomas," she said, leading me to a home office at the back of the house. "I appreciate your discretion in requesting this meeting away from the office. And I appreciate you agreeing to it," I replied, setting my briefcase on a chair. "What I need to discuss involves both personal and institutional concerns." Elizabeth gestured for me to continue, her lawyer's composure firmly in place. "First, there's the matter of my severance," I began, removing a copy of my original contract. "According to Clause 15C, I'm entitled to significantly more than what was offered." She took the document, reading the highlighted section carefully. Her eyes widened slightly, the only indication of surprise she allowed herself. "This appears to be valid," she said after a moment. "I'll need to review it against our current records, but if this clause was never superseded, then yes, the calculation would be different. 25 months instead of 2, I clarified, plus benefits for the same period and compensation for unused leave. Elizabeth made a note. "I'll look into this immediately. If there's been an oversight, we'll certainly correct it." "Thank you. But that's actually not my primary concern today." I then methodically laid out everything I'd discovered about the Meridian Fund, the shifted investment strategy, the misleading client disclosures, the connections to Richard's family, and the apparent efforts to conceal these issues by removing me and limiting information access. As I spoke, Elizabeth's expression grew increasingly grave. A consummate professional, she asked precise, targeted questions that told me she immediately understood the legal and ethical implications. "These are extremely serious allegations," she said when I finished. "If accurate, they represent potential violations of securities law, fiduciary duty, and company policy." "Everything I've shared is documented," I replied, handing her the package I'd prepared. "This contains copies of all relevant materials, including the sources." She accepted, her manner now distinctly formal. "I'll need time to review this thoroughly and verify the information independently." "Of course, but I should note that the quarterly board meeting is scheduled for next week. If the patterns I've identified continue, the board may unknowingly approve actions that could exacerbate these issues." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I understand the time sensitivity. Given the nature of these concerns, I have an obligation to investigate promptly. That's all I'm asking. My goal isn't to damage Wellington. It's to address problems that could hurt a lot of people if left unchecked." "And your severance claim? Are you connecting these issues?" "A fair question. They're separate matters legally, but obviously related in timing and circumstance. I'm entitled to what my contract specifies regardless. But I would have brought these Meridian Fund concerns to your attention even without the severance issue." She studied me, weighing my words. "I believe you would have. You've always been known for your integrity, Thomas." And as I prepared to leave, Elizabeth asked one more question. "Have you shared this information with anyone else? Regulators? The board?" "No," I assured her. "I'm bringing it to you first, as Wellington's legal counsel. How it's handled here is your decision, guided by your professional and ethical obligations." She appreciated that answer. I could tell from the slight relaxation in her posture. By respecting the proper channels, I'd given her room to address the situation without feeling cornered or publicly challenged. Driving home, I felt a curious lightness. For the first time since being fired, I wasn't focused on what I'd lost or how I'd been wronged. Instead, I was acting to protect something larger than myself, the institution I'd helped build and the clients who trusted it with their financial futures. Linda was waiting at home, anxious to hear how the meeting had gone. She listened, I said simply, really listened, and she'll act. She has to. How soon? I don't know. But with the board meeting coming up, she doesn't have much time to analyze everything. The waiting began. Days passed with no word from Elizabeth or anyone at Wellington. I occupied myself with small projects around the house, fixing the creaky step on the back porch, organizing the garage, tasks I'd been putting off for years. Linda watched me with a mixture of amusement and concern. "You're nesting," she observed on the third day, finding me regrouting the bathroom tiles. "Like you're preparing for something. Just catching up on neglected chores," I replied, though she wasn't wrong. I was preparing, mentally and emotionally, for whatever came next. On the fourth day, my phone rang. Elizabeth Wong's name appeared on the screen. "Thomas," she said without preamble, "I've completed my initial review of the materials you provided. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow morning? There have been developments you should be aware of." Her tone gave nothing away, but the fact that she wanted to meet at Wellington rather than her home suggested something significant had occurred. "Of course," I agreed. "What time?" 8 o'clock, before regular office hours. Use the executive entrance. I'll have a temporary access card waiting for you. The stage was set for the next phase. Whatever Elizabeth had discovered, whatever actions she'd taken or planned to take, tomorrow would begin the resolution of this complex situation. I would finally learn whether my career at Wellington would end with quiet dismissal or with accountability for those who had tried to silence me. The next morning, I arrived at Wellington's headquarters precisely at 8. The building was quiet, with only security and early arriving executives present. At the executive entrance, a security guard I didn't recognize handed me a temporary access badge. "Ms. Wong is expecting you, Mr. Greene. 18th floor, suite 1820. The elevator ride felt surreal, returning to the building I'd left just days ago under such different circumstances. When the doors opened, Elizabeth was waiting in the hallway. "Thank you for coming," she said, guiding me not to her office but to a small conference room nearby. Inside, to my surprise, sat Janet Hargrove, the chairwoman of Wellington's board of directors. "Thomas," Janet greeted me, extending her hand. "It's been too long." I had worked with Janet years ago, before her appointment to the board, when she oversaw regional operations. She had always been fair and straightforward, qualities that had propelled her to the top. "Please sit," Elizabeth said, closing the door. "What's discussed here stays here, at least for now." I nodded, taking a seat across from Janet. "I've spent the past 3 days reviewing your information," Elizabeth began without preamble. After initial verification, I felt compelled to bring this directly to Janet's attention, given the seriousness of the issues involved. Janet leaned forward, her expression grave. "Elizabeth has shared your findings regarding the Meridian Fund, along with additional documentation her team has uncovered. I want you to know that we're treating this with the utmost seriousness." "What additional documentation?" I asked. Elizabeth opened a folder. "After our meeting, I initiated a confidential review of all Meridian Fund transactions and communications. What we found confirms your suspicions and reveals additional concerns. There are at least 7 companies receiving investments from the fund that have direct connections to either Richard or James Miller. The total exposure is approximately $42 million. "And the risk disclosures?" I asked. "Systematically misrepresented," Janet confirmed. "The fund's official communications to clients report a moderate risk profile with diversified holdings. The actual investments are concentrated in speculative ventures, many without established track records. Most concerning, Elizabeth continued, is evidence of deliberate concealment. Richard established a pattern of compartmentalizing information, ensuring no single department had visibility into the full picture. When individuals raised questions, as you did, they were reassigned or, in your case, terminated. Janet's expression hardened. Thomas, I want to personally apologize for what happened to you. It should never have occurred, and it represents a significant failure of oversight on our part. I nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement, but more concerned about what would happen next. What actions are you planning to take? I asked. Janet and Elizabeth exchanged glances. That's partly why we asked you here, Janet said. The board's audit committee meets tomorrow morning. Elizabeth will present her findings and immediate action will follow. Richard will be suspended pending a full investigation, as will Michael Sawyer and anyone else directly implicated. However, Elizabeth added, we're facing a delicate situation. If news of potential fraud in the Meridian Fund becomes public before we can implement proper controls, we risk a client panic that could damage Wellington beyond repair. Even clients with no connection to the fund might withdraw their investments. Out of general concern, I understood immediately. You need time to contain the situation. Precisely, Janet confirmed. Our priority must be protecting clients' interests, all clients, not just those in the Meridian Fund. We need to freeze suspicious transactions, implement proper risk controls, and prepare accurate disclosures before making any public announcements. Where do I fit into this? I asked, though I had begun to suspect their purpose in bringing me here. Janet leaned forward. Thomas, we'd like you to return to Wellington, effective immediately. Not to your old position, but as acting chief risk officer, reporting directly to me and the board. You know the systems, you understand the issues, and most importantly, you've demonstrated the integrity this situation demands. The offer caught me off guard. I had expected many possible outcomes from this meeting, but not this. What about my termination? The severance issue? We've reviewed your contract, Elizabeth said. You're absolutely correct about Clause 15C. The company owes you substantially more than what was offered. That will be addressed regardless of your decision about returning. But, Janet added, we hope you'll consider this opportunity. Wellington needs someone with your expertise and ethical compass right now, not just to address the Meridian situation, but to help rebuild proper risk management throughout the organization. I considered their offer carefully. Returning would mean working alongside people who had been complicit in my dismissal, even if temporarily. It would mean long hours and intense pressure as we untangled the mess Richard had created. But it would also mean a chance to protect the institution I'd helped build and the clients who relied on it. I have conditions, I said finally. Janet nodded. Name them. Complete autonomy in reviewing all investment products, not just Meridian. Full access to all records without exception. Authority to implement immediate risk controls where needed. And Sarah Matthews joins me as deputy. Chief Risk Officer, she tried to flag these issues and deserves recognition. Granted, Janet said without hesitation. Anything else? Yes. I want Michael Sawyer reassigned immediately. Not fired yet, that would raise questions we're not ready to answer, but moved to a position with no authority over risk assessments or client funds. Elizabeth made notes. That can be arranged. I'll draft the necessary paperwork this morning. When would you want me to start? I asked. Today, if possible, Janet replied. The audit committee meets at 9 tomorrow morning. We need you to help prepare a comprehensive assessment and action plan by then. I took a deep breath, considering the implications. Linda would understand. She'd always supported my commitment to doing what was right, even when it came at personal cost. I'll need to call my wife. and I'll need my systems access restored immediately. Full administrative privileges. Janet nodded to Elizabeth, who made another note. We'll have IT. Set everything up within the hour. You'll have an office on this floor temporarily. As they outlined the immediate next steps, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also a heavy sense of responsibility. What had begun as personal injustice had revealed systemic problems that threatened thousands of clients and hundreds of employees. Addressing it properly would require careful strategy and precise execution. After calling Linda to explain the situation, I spent the morning with Elizabeth's team, reviewing their findings and adding my own insights. By noon, we had established a war room in a conference center 2 floors below the executive suites. Close. Enough for necessary communication, but removed from Richard's immediate awareness. Sarah arrived shortly after lunch, summoned by HR for a special project. Her confusion turned to determination when I explained the situation. I knew something was wrong with those fund allocations, she said, examining the documentation. We'd assembled. Michael's been systematically overriding risk flags in the system. When I questioned it, he said it was executive direction and to focus on other priorities. He won't be giving directions anymore, I assured her. As of this afternoon, you're the acting Deputy Chief Risk Officer, reporting directly to me, and through me to the board. Her eyes widened. Seriously, what about Richard? What about Michael? They don't know yet, and they won't until tomorrow's audit committee meeting. Until then, we have work to do. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, our team grew carefully. Elizabeth brought in 2 trusted attorneys from her department. Janet added the head of internal audit and the company's controller. By 7 p.m., we had 10 people working in coordinated fashion, building a complete picture of the Meridian Fund's actual holdings, risk exposure, and conflicts of interest. The pattern that emerged was both sophisticated and alarming. Richard had used his position to gradually shift the fund's investment strategy while maintaining the appearance of its original conservative approach. The quarterly reports to clients showed steady, modest returns and diversified holdings. The actual investments had become increasingly concentrated in speculative ventures, many connected to his brother's business interests. Most concerning were the liquidity projections. If even a moderate percentage of investors attempted to withdraw funds simultaneously, the Meridian Fund would be unable to meet those obligations without selling illiquid assets at significant losses. It's a house of cards, Sarah said around midnight, looking at our completed risk assessment. If this became public knowledge tomorrow, we'd have a run on the fund by noon. Which is exactly why we need a containment plan before the audit. Committee meeting, I replied. Let's outline the immediate controls we need to implement. By 3 a.m., we had developed a comprehensive strategy. Freeze all new investments in the Meridian Fund, implement enhanced approval requirements for any withdrawals over a certain threshold, prepare accurate risk disclosures for all clients, and develop a restructuring plan to gradually move investments into properly diversified holdings. This is going to be expensive, noted William Chen, the controller. Unwinding some of these positions will mean accepting losses. Less expensive than regulatory fines and class action lawsuits, I countered, and far less damaging than the complete collapse of client confidence. At 7 a.m., after barely 3 hours of sleep on office couches, our team reconvened to finalize the presentation for the audit committee. Janet joined us, reviewing our findings and recommendations with careful attention. This is thorough work, she said finally. The committee will have questions, but the path forward is clear. What about Richard? Sarah asked. He's scheduled to present the quarterly results to the full board tomorrow afternoon. He won't be making that presentation, Janet replied firmly. Once the audit committee reviews this information, we'll Move immediately to suspend him pending investigation. Michael as well. And if they resist, I asked. They won't have a choice, Elizabeth interjected. The evidence of conflicts of interest alone is sufficient grounds for immediate suspension under company bylaws. If necessary, we'll have security. Escort them from the building. The audit committee meeting began promptly at 9 a.m. 5 board members sat around the mahogany table in the boardroom, expressions growing increasingly grave as Janet opened the session with an overview of the situation. Before we proceed further, she said, I want to introduce Thomas Greene, who has agreed to return to Wellington as acting chief risk officer to help address this situation. It was Mr. Greene who initially identified the irregularities in the Meridian Fund, and for his diligence, he was improperly terminated last week. I nodded acknowledgement as Elizabeth began presenting our findings. For the next hour, we methodically walked the committee through the evidence, the risk assessment, and our proposed action plan. Questions were sharp but focused, with no attempt to minimize the seriousness of the situation. This is deeply disturbing, said Robert Vaughan, the committee chair, when we concluded. The deliberate nature of these actions, the systematic concealment, and this goes beyond poor judgment. This appears to be fraud. We agree, Janet replied, which is why immediate action is essential. The vote was unanimous. Richard Miller and Michael Sawyer would be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. All our recommended risk controls would be implemented at once, and the full board would be briefed in an emergency session that afternoon, replacing the originally scheduled quarterly review. Mr. Greene, Robert Vaughan said as the meeting concluded, the board appreciates your willingness to return and help address this situation, especially given the circumstances of your departure. Please know that you have our full confidence and support. I nodded my thanks, but my mind was already on the next steps. The committee's decision was just the beginning. Now came the challenging part, implementing these changes while maintaining stability and confidence. As we left the boardroom, Elizabeth touched my arm. Richard's in his office. Security is standing by, but we thought you might want to be present. I considered declining. There would be no satisfaction in watching Richard's downfall, only the grim necessity of protecting the institution from further damage. Yes, I said finally, I should be there. We found Richard at his desk, reviewing presentation materials for the board meeting he would never attend. He looked up in confusion as Janet, Elizabeth, and I entered, followed by 2 security officers. "What's going on?" he asked, his expression shifting to alarm when he noticed me. "Thomas, why are you here?" "Richard Miller," Janet said formally. "By direction of the audit committee, you are suspended effective immediately pending investigation into serious misconduct regarding the management of the Meridian Fund and related matters." The color drained from his face. "What? This is absurd. What misconduct?" "Conflicts of interest, misrepresentation of investment risks, directing fund investments to companies connected to your family members without proper disclosure, falsification of risk assessments." Elizabeth recited the charges in her calm attorney's voice. "Security will escort you from the building. Your access to all company systems has been terminated. You are not to contact any Wellington employees or clients during the investigation." Richard's shock gave way to anger as he turned to me. "You did this. You couldn't accept being replaced, so you've concocted some—" "Mr. Miller," I interrupted quietly, "every finding has been independently verified by Wellington's legal team and controller's office. This isn't about me. It's about what you did." His face contorted. "You have no idea what you're doing. The Meridian Fund is perfectly sound. This will cause a panic for nothing. We've reviewed the fund's actual holdings and liquidity position." I replied evenly. "We know exactly what we're dealing with, and we're implementing controls to protect our clients, all of our clients. Security stepped forward as Richard began gathering his personal items, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Not by a long shot." "Actually, Richard, it is," Janet said firmly. "The evidence is overwhelming. The only question now is whether this remains an internal disciplinary matter or becomes a criminal referral. That will depend on your cooperation during the investigation." That silenced him. As security led him out, I felt no triumph, only a weary determination to move forward with the enormous task ahead. Similar scenes played out across the building as Michael and two other executives directly implicated in the scheme were suspended. By noon, our team had implemented the first phase of risk controls, placing temporary holds on large transactions within the Meridian Fund and beginning the process of accurately reassessing its holdings. The full board meeting that afternoon was somber but resolute. After reviewing our findings and action plan, they unanimously endorsed the Audit Committee's decisions and formally appointed me as Acting Chief Risk Officer with expanded authority. "We've notified regulators of potential issues that may require disclosure," Elizabeth informed the board. "We haven't provided specific details yet, as we're still completing our internal investigation, but we've placed them on notice that there may be regulatory filings forthcoming." "What about our clients?" asked one board member. "When do we tell them?" "We're preparing accurate disclosures now," I explained. "For Meridian Fund investors, we'll be scheduling individual consultations, beginning tomorrow, to discuss the actual risk profile of their investments and options moving forward. For other clients, we'll issue a statement next week explaining that we've identified and addressed risk management issues in one specific product with no impact on other Wellington investments." "And the media?" another asked. "This will leak eventually." "We've prepared holding statements," Janet replied, "but our focus must be on fixing the problems first, then communicating appropriately with those affected. Rushing to public statements before we've implemented proper controls would be irresponsible." As the meeting concluded, the enormity of what lay ahead became clear. We weren't just addressing a single fund's problems. We were rebuilding trust. In Wellington's entire risk management infrastructure, the work would take months, not days. By evening, as I finally prepared to head home, the first phase of our containment strategy was in place. Sarah and her team had implemented system controls to prevent any further unauthorized changes to risk assessments. Legal had begun preparing revised disclosure documents, and a forensic accounting team was tracing every transaction in the Meridian Fund for the past 2 years. In the temporary office I'd been assigned, Janet found me gathering my things to leave. "Long day," she observed, leaning against the doorframe. "The first of many, I expect." I nodded, too tired for unnecessary words. "I owe you an apology, Thomas, not just for what happened last week, but for the governance failures that allowed it to happen. The board should have provided better oversight." "We all missed signals," I acknowledged. "The important thing now is fixing the problems and making sure they don't happen again." She studied me thoughtfully. "When this is stabilized, and it will be, we'll need to talk about a permanent arrangement. Wellington needs leadership with your values." I smiled slightly. "One crisis at a time, Janet. For now, let's focus on protecting what we can." Driving home that evening, I reflected on the extraordinary turn of events. A week ago, I'd been abruptly discarded after 25 years of service. Now, I was returning with expanded authority and the explicit backing of the board. But the circumstances were hardly triumphant. Wellington faced its greatest crisis in decades, one that threatened its reputation and possibly its survival. Linda was waiting on the porch when I pulled into our driveway, a glass of wine ready. She'd always had an intuitive sense of when I needed quiet support rather than conversation. "Long day?" she asked as I settled beside her. The first of many, I replied, echoing Janet's words. It's worse than we thought. Richard wasn't just making room for his nephew. He was actively diverting investments to companies connected to his family. Conflicts of interest, misrepresented, risks, the works. She sipped her wine thoughtfully. And they've brought you back to clean up the mess. Acting Chief Risk Officer, reporting directly to the board. Sarah's my deputy. We've got our work cut out for us. How do you feel about it, going back to the place that pushed you out? I considered the question carefully. It's not about vindication. It's about protecting something I helped build. Thousands of people have their retirement savings with Wellington. Hundreds more depend on the company for their livelihoods. Someone has to fix this, and I know the systems better than anyone. Linda squeezed my hand. That's why they need you, not just for your knowledge, but for who you are. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in oranges and purples. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, client meetings, regulatory disclosures, team building. The road ahead would be difficult, with no guarantee of success. But tonight, I found a measure of peace in knowing that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. My phone chimed with a text message from Sarah. First client meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m., major investor in Meridian. I've pulled all their records. I texted back, we'll be ready, get some rest. In that moment, sitting on my porch with Linda beside me, I realized something important. While finding Clause 15C in my original contract had started this process, the real discovery had been something else entirely. The recognition that some principles transcend personal grievances. That protecting the institution I'd helped build and the people who relied on it mattered more than my own vindication. The contract clause had given me leverage, but integrity had given me purpose, and in the days ahead, that purpose would guide every decision, every action, every step of the difficult journey to restore what had been damaged. Not just for my own satisfaction, but for something much larger, the responsibility we all share to stand against wrongdoing when we encounter it, especially when others depend on us to do so. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight I was ready for them. The following week was the most intense of my professional career. While the board had acted swiftly to remove Richard and his allies, the real work of addressing the Meridian Fund crisis was just beginning. Each day brought new discoveries, each more troubling than the last. On Monday morning, Sarah and I met with representatives from Wellington's 10 largest Meridian Fund investors. These weren't ordinary clients. They were sophisticated institutional investors who had placed their trust in our firm based on decades of reputation for prudent management. Mr. Greene, began Harold Winters, the investment director for the Pennsylvania Teachers' Pension Fund. I understand you've recently returned to Wellington in a new capacity. Perhaps you can explain why we're suddenly hearing concerns about a fund that was reported to be performing admirably just last quarter. All eyes turned to me. The conference room was tense with unspoken accusations and the growing realization that something had gone seriously wrong. Mr. Winters, everyone, thank you for coming on short notice, I began. I'll be direct. And to you, internal review has identified significant discrepancies between how the Meridian Fund was represented to you and its actual composition and risk profile. I'm not here to minimize this situation or offer excuses. I'm here to give you accurate information and discuss our plan to address these issues. For the next hour, I methodically walked them through what we had found, the concentrated positions in speculative ventures, the liquidity constraints, the conflicts of interest. I didn't sugarcoat anything. These clients deserved the unvarnished truth, however difficult it might be to deliver. When I finished, the room was silent for several long moments. So, to be clear, said Patricia Gomez from First National Bank's Trust Department, You're telling us that approximately 40% of the fund is invested in privately held companies with limited transparency, several of which have direct connections to your former COO's family. That's correct, I confirmed. And those investments were made without proper disclosure of these relationships. This is potentially criminal activity, Harold stated bluntly. Have you contacted regulators? Yes, I nodded. We've initiated contact with the SEC and are cooperating fully. We expect formal investigations to begin shortly. The questions continued, pointed and direct. No one raised their voice or made threats, but the underlying message was clear. Fix this or face consequences far beyond regulatory penalties. We have developed a stabilization plan, I explained, distributing detailed packets prepared over the weekend. Rather than forcing a fire sale of illiquid assets, which would harm all investors, we're proposing a structured approach that protects your interests while addressing the fundamental issues. The plan was comprehensive. Temporarily freeze new, withdrawals over certain thresholds to prevent a run on the fund, conduct proper valuations of all holdings, gradually rebalance the portfolio toward properly disclosed risk parameters, and provide investors with options, including facilitated transfers to other Wellington funds or managed exit strategies. This will take time, I acknowledged, but rushing could turn a serious problem into a catastrophic one. We're asking for your patience as we work to preserve value and restore proper management. After 2 more hours of detailed discussion, the institutional investors agreed to a 30-day stabilization period, during which they would maintain their positions while we implemented the first phase of reforms. It wasn't unconditional support. They would be watching closely, but it gave us the breathing room we desperately needed. As they filed out, Harold Winters lingered behind. "Thomas," he said when we were alone, "I've known you for 15 years? Always found you to be straight shooter." "I appreciate that, Harold. When all this broke loose, the board voted to pull our entire relationship with Wellington, not just Meridian, everything, over $300 million in assets." My stomach tightened. "And now?" "I convinced them to wait, see how you handle this. My reputation's on the line here too." He fixed me with a penetrating stare. "Don't make me regret it." After he left, Sarah slumped into a chair. That was brutal, but they're staying at least for now. "For now," I agreed, "but we've got a long way to go." The rest of the week unfolded in a blur of activity. Our forensic accounting team discovered additional problematic investments, bringing the total exposure to related party transactions to nearly $50 million. The regulatory situation grew more complex as we made our initial disclosures to the SEC, triggering formal inquiries that would require thousands of hours of documentation and testimony. Meanwhile, Richard wasn't going quietly. Through his attorney, he demanded reinstatement, claiming he had been ambushed by unfounded allegations and threatening litigation for wrongful termination. The board stood firm, but his aggressive stance confirmed what I had suspected. He wouldn't admit wrongdoing or seek resolution. He would fight, regardless of the damage to Wellington. By Thursday, we faced a new challenge. Despite our best efforts at confidentiality, rumors had begun circulating in the financial press. The Wall Street Journal published a brief item noting personnel changes at Wellington and regulatory inquiries regarding one of our investment products. Vague, but enough to prompt calls from reporters seeking details. "We need to get ahead of this," I told Janet during our daily update. "Reactive statements won't be enough if this breaks wide open." She nodded grimly. "The PR team has prepared a statement, but it feels inadequate given what we're dealing with." "Because it is," I said. "We need a different approach, not just statements, but actions that demonstrate accountability." That evening, we convened an emergency strategy session with Janet, Elizabeth, and the communications team. The traditional playbook for financial firms facing such crises was straightforward. Admit as little as possible, speak in generalities about reviewing procedures, and wait for the story to fade. But I pushed for something different. What if we hold a press conference? I suggested, not to disclose confidential client information, but to acknowledge the problems directly and outline the steps we're taking to address them. The communications director looked horrified. That's not how these situations are usually handled. It could amplify the story, invite additional scrutiny. The scrutiny is coming regardless, I countered. We can't hide what happened, but we can demonstrate that Wellington as an institution is responding with integrity, even if certain individuals failed to uphold our standards. After hours of debate, Janet made the decision. Thomas is right. Transparency is our only viable path forward. Schedule it for Monday morning. The weekend was consumed with preparations, drafting statements, anticipating questions, coordinating with legal to ensure we didn't compromise the ongoing investigation. Throughout it all, I couldn't help reflecting on the irony of my position. A week ago, I had been unceremoniously dismissed. Now, I was helping craft the public narrative that would determine Wellington's future. Monday morning arrived with a fresh complication. The Financial Times had published a more detailed article, naming the Meridian Fund specifically, and reporting that sources familiar with the matter described significant irregularities in its management. The story mentioned Richard's suspension, but didn't detail the nepotism or conflicts of interest. Still, it was enough to send phones ringing throughout our offices as clients sought reassurance. The press conference was set for 10 a.m. in Wellington's main conference centre. Journalists from major financial publications filled the room, along with representatives from local television stations. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Financial firms rarely held press conferences to discuss internal matters. Janet opened the proceedings, projecting calm authority as cameras flashed and recorders captured every word. Good morning. I'm Janet Hargrove, Chair of Wellington Financial's Board of Directors. Thank you for joining us. I want to address recent reports regarding Wellington and specifically our Meridian Fund product. Rather than respond with prepared statements alone, we believe our clients and the public deserve direct communication about this situation. She continued with remarkable candor, outlining the basic facts. Internal reviews had identified serious issues with the Meridian Fund's management. Senior executives, including Richard Miller, had been suspended pending investigation, and the firm was cooperating fully with regulatory inquiries. While we cannot discuss all details due to ongoing investigations, I want to be clear. This situation falls far short of Wellington's standards. We are taking immediate action to address it. She then introduced me. Leading our response is Thomas Greene, our acting Chief Risk Officer. Mr. Greene has been with Wellington for 25 years and is widely respected for his integrity and expertise. I'll now ask him to outline the steps we're taking. As I approached the podium, I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon me. My prepared remarks sat before me, but I decided to speak more directly. For over 40 years, Wellington Financial has built its reputation on trust. That trust was broken by the actions of certain individuals who failed to uphold the standards that define this institution. As someone who has devoted most of my professional life to Wellington, I find this deeply painful. But addressing it requires honesty, not evasion. I outlined our approach: comprehensive review of all investment products, enhanced oversight protocols, direct communication with affected clients, and structural reforms to prevent similar issues in the future. We could have handled this differently, I acknowledged. We could have made vague statements about reviewing procedures while hoping the story faded from public attention. Many firms take that approach, but that would compound the initial failure with a second one, the failure to demonstrate real accountability. The questions from journalists were pointed and sometimes uncomfortable. Had clients lost money? Were criminal charges possible? How had this happened despite supposed oversight? Janet and I answered each one as directly as possible without compromising confidential information or the ongoing investigations. Near the end, a reporter from Bloomberg asked the question I had been anticipating. "Mr. Greene, sources tell us you were terminated just days before these issues came to light, then brought back in this new role. Can you explain what happened?" I glanced at Janet, who nodded slightly. "Yes, that's correct. I was informed my position was being eliminated as part of a departmental restructuring. Shortly thereafter, information emerged regarding the Meridian Fund that prompted the board to take action. I was asked to return in this new capacity to help address the situation." "Are you suggesting you were fired for raising concerns about the fund?" the reporter pressed. "I won't speculate about motives," I replied carefully. "What matters now is fixing the problems, not assigning blame. Wellington is more than any individual. It's an institution that thousands of people rely on. My focus is on restoring the trust they deserve." As the press conference concluded, I felt a cautious sense of relief. We had done something rarely seen in the financial world, acknowledged serious problems directly, and outlined specific steps to address them. The coverage might be painful in the short term, but it laid the groundwork for rebuilding trust. Back in my office, messages had piled up. Most notable was an email from Harold Winters. "Watch the press conference. Gutsy move. Pension board is staying put for now." Similar messages came from other institutional investors. They weren't offering unconditional support, but our transparency had earned us time to demonstrate real change. Not all reactions were positive. Richard's attorney issued a statement claiming he was being scapegoated for management decisions that were fully disclosed to and approved by appropriate parties. It was a transparent attempt to shift blame, but it signaled his intent to fight rather than cooperate. More concerning was a message from Elizabeth regarding the SEC investigation. "They're expanding the scope beyond Meridian. Looking at all fund products now, need to discuss implications." The regulatory scrutiny was intensifying, as we had expected. The challenge now was maintaining normal operations while cooperating fully with investigators and implementing our reform agenda. That afternoon, I met with Sarah and her expanded team to review progress on the Meridian stabilization plan. The news was mixed. "We've completed full valuations of about 70% of the holdings," she reported. "The liquid assets are generally aligned with reported values, but the private investments," she grimaced, "several appear significantly overvalued on our books." "How significantly?" I asked. "Based on preliminary assessments, we're looking at potential write-downs of 20–30% for at least 4 major holdings." This was worse than I had anticipated. Such write-downs would dramatically impact the fund's reported performance and could trigger another wave of withdrawal requests. "What about the related party transactions, the companies connected to Richard's family?" Sarah's expression darkened. "That's where the largest discrepancies appear. 2 companies in particular, Vertex Systems and Next Gen Solutions, show almost no operational activity despite receiving over $15 million in investments from Meridian." "Shell companies," I muttered. "Looks that way. The forensic team is still tracing the money flows, but preliminary findings suggest at least some funds were redirected to other entities controlled by James Miller. This shifted the situation from serious mismanagement to potential fraud. If Meridian money had been deliberately funneled through shell companies to benefit Richard's family directly, criminal charges became much more likely. "We need to brief Elizabeth immediately," I said. This changes our disclosure obligations. Later that evening, Janet, Elizabeth, and I sat in the boardroom reviewing the latest findings. If these allegations prove true, we're no longer talking about conflicts of interest or poor risk management, Elizabeth said gravely. We're talking about deliberate misappropriation of client funds. Janet looked physically pained. How could this happen? How could our controls fail so completely? Richard systematically dismantled them, I explained. He removed or reassigned people who raised questions. He compartmentalized information so no one had the complete picture, and he installed his nephew in a key position to ensure compliance. Oversight was minimal. The board should have seen this, Janet said, shaking her head. I should have seen it. Richard was very effective at managing up, I replied. He presented impressive results, spoke confidently about innovation and growth. Most boards would be inclined to trust an executive who consistently delivers good news. Well, that trust was misplaced, Janet said firmly. And now we have to deal with the consequences. What's our next step? We need to provide this information to the SEC immediately, Elizabeth advised. Their investigation will uncover it regardless, and we don't want to appear to be withholding evidence of potential criminal activity. Agreed, I said, but we also need to prepare for the impact on the Meridian Fund. Once we formalize these write-downs, the fund's performance will look very different than what was reported to clients. Could this trigger a collapse? Janet asked. Not if we manage it properly, I replied. We already have the withdrawal limitations in place for 30 days. We need to use that time to develop a restructuring plan that gives clients options while preventing a fire sale of assets. As our meeting concluded, Elizabeth raised one more concern. Richard's attorney has requested meetings with several Wellington employees as part of his defense strategy. He's positioning this as a witch hunt orchestrated by Thomas as revenge for his termination. Janet dismissed this with a wave. That narrative falls apart the moment anyone looks at the evidence, but it does remind us that Richard will use every tool at his disposal to fight back. Let him try, I said quietly. The facts speak for themselves. Over the next 2 days, events accelerated rapidly. Our disclosure to the SEC about the shell companies prompted them to expand their investigation, sending a larger team to review Wellington's records. The forensic accountants confirmed that at least $12 million had been transferred from Meridian Investments through Vertex and NextGen to other entities with direct connections to the Miller family. On Thursday morning, the situation reached a turning point. I was reviewing risk assessments for Wellington's other investment products when Elizabeth burst into my office without knocking. The FBI just arrived, she said, her voice tight. They're executing search warrants for Richard's office and files, as well as Michael's. The U.S. Attorney's Office has opened a criminal investigation. Though we had anticipated escalation to criminal authorities, the speed and public nature of the FBI's arrival sent shockwaves through the building. Employees watched wide-eyed as agents removed boxes of documents and electronic devices. Within hours, the story broke across financial news outlets. FBI raids Wellington Financial amid fraud allegations. Janet called an emergency all-staff meeting in the company auditorium. Hundreds of anxious employees filed in, their expressions ranging from shock to anger to fear. Many had worked with Richard for years. Some considered him a mentor. For them, this wasn't just an institutional crisis, it was deeply personal. Janet addressed them with remarkable candor. I know many of you are confused and concerned about what's happening. I wish I could tell you this is all a misunderstanding that will soon be resolved. But the truth is more difficult. We have discovered serious misconduct involving the Meridian Fund, misconduct that appears to have benefited certain individuals at the expense of our clients. She continued, explaining the situation in broad terms while being careful not to prejudge the outcome of the investigations. I want to be clear about two things. First, Wellington as an institution will cooperate fully with all investigations. Second, the actions of a few individuals do not define this company or the 800 people who work here with integrity every day. She then asked me to speak about our path forward. As I approached the podium, I could feel the tension in the room. Many of these people had been my colleagues for decades. Others had joined more recently and knew me only as the executive who had mysteriously departed and then returned. For 25 years, I've walked through Wellington's doors, proud of what we stand for, I began. That pride was shaken last week, but not because I was let go. It was shaken because I discovered that some among us had betrayed the trust our clients place in us. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Many of you are wondering what this means for your futures, for your careers at Wellington. That's a valid concern. But I want you to know this. The strength of this institution has never been in its executives or its fancy offices. It's been in people like you, the ones who do honest work every day, who serve clients with integrity, who build something meaningful together. The tension in the room began to ease slightly as I outlined specific steps we were taking to stabilize operations and protect client assets. This will be a difficult period. The investigations will be thorough. The media coverage will be intense. But Wellington will emerge stronger if we face this crisis with honesty and commitment to doing what's right. As the meeting concluded, Sarah approached me. You know what's happening out there, right? LinkedIn is exploding with Wellington employees updating their profiles. Headhunters are circling like sharks. Expected, I nodded, but we need to focus on those who stay, not those who leave. And what about Richard? Have you heard anything? I shook my head. Not directly, but his attorney issued another statement claiming he's being railroaded and will be fully vindicated when all facts emerge. Sarah snorted. Hard to explain away $12 million flowing to his family through shell companies. He'll try, I replied. People like Richard rarely admit wrongdoing, even when the evidence is overwhelming. The next morning brought news that dramatically altered the landscape. Richard Miller had been arrested at his home on preliminary charges of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. The U.S. attorney held a brief press conference announcing the arrest and noting that the investigation was ongoing with additional charges possible. The arrest made national news, with Wellington's name prominently featured in every headline. Our phone lines were flooded with calls from clients, partners, and media. The crisis communications team worked around the clock, responding with carefully crafted statements that acknowledged the seriousness of the situation while emphasizing that Wellington was cooperating fully and taking decisive action to protect client interests. By the weekend, we had reached a pivotal moment. The initial shock was subsiding, replaced by the grinding reality of managing a complex crisis. The Meridian Fund had been officially revalued, with write-downs of approximately 22% across its portfolio. As expected, this triggered another wave of withdrawal requests, but our 30-day stabilization plan held firm, preventing a disorderly collapse. More encouragingly, our other investment products were maintaining stability. The forensic review had found no similar issues in Wellington's broader portfolio, allowing us to assure clients that the problems were contained to Meridian and its management. On Sunday evening, I received an unexpected call from Robert Vaughan, the Audit Committee Chair. Thomas, the board held an emergency session today, he began. We've been assessing Wellington's leadership needs in light of recent events. Understandable, I replied, wondering where this was leading. We've reached several decisions. First, Richard Miller has been formally terminated for cause. His employment contract included moral turpitude clauses that are clearly applicable given the criminal charges. No surprise there, I commented. Second, we've decided to make your appointment permanent. The board unanimously voted to name you Chief Risk Officer, with expanded authority, including oversight of all investment products and compliance functions. This was unexpected. I had assumed my role would remain temporary until the crisis was resolved. That's a significant responsibility, I said carefully. It is, but you've demonstrated exactly the leadership Wellington needs right now: integrity, transparency, and the courage to address difficult issues directly. The board is also implementing broader governance reforms to ensure proper oversight moving forward. And my original contract, I asked. The severance issue under Clause 15C? Already resolved, Robert assured me. Elizabeth has prepared amendments to your employment agreement incorporating the full severance terms from your original contract, plus enhanced protections against any future attempt to remove you without cause. The board approved those as well. After we hung up, I sat on my back porch, processing this latest development. The vindication was complete. Not just reinstated, but elevated to an executive role, with board-level support and explicit contractual protections. Yet it felt hollow, given the circumstances. Wellington was fighting for its institutional life. Clients were questioning their trust. Employees were uncertain about their futures. My victory came amid a broader tragedy for an institution I had helped build over decades. Linda joined me, setting a cup of tea beside me. "Good news or bad?" she asked, noting my expression. "Both, I suppose. The board has made my position permanent. Chief Risk Officer with expanded authority." "That's validation," she said, sitting beside me. "They recognize what I've always known about you. It's a lot of responsibility. Wellington has a long road ahead before trust is fully restored." She took my hand. "And they want you to lead that journey. That says everything about who you are, Tom." As the sun set, casting long shadows across our yard, I found myself contemplating the strange path that had led to this moment. What had begun with a humiliating dismissal had evolved into something far more complex. A test of character, values, and commitment to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. The contract clause that Richard had overlooked had been my entry point, the leverage that allowed me to return and address a much larger wrong. But the real oversight hadn't been a legal technicality. It had been the fundamental misjudgment of character. The belief that someone who had invested 25 years in building something would simply walk away when treated unjustly, especially when that injustice was tied to systematic misconduct. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more meetings with regulators, difficult conversations with clients, the continuing work of rebuilding systems and trust. But tonight, sitting with Linda as darkness fell, I felt a quiet certainty that Wellington would survive this crisis, emerging stronger precisely because it had faced its failures honestly. Sometimes, I reflected, the most important clause in any contract isn't written on paper. It's the unspoken commitment to integrity that defines who we are when tested. Richard had overlooked that most fundamental clause, and that, more than any legal technicality, had been his greatest mistake. 6 months later, I stood at the window of my new office on the executive floor, watching the Philadelphia skyline glitter in the morning sun. The nameplate on my door read, "Thomas Greene, Chief Risk Officer and Executive Vice President," titles that still felt somewhat strange after 25 years as a department head. The transformation at Wellington had been sweeping. Richard Miller and Michael Sawyer were both facing federal charges, with Richard additionally charged with embezzlement, after the investigation revealed he had personally diverted over $3 million from shell companies funded by Meridian Investments. 3 other executives implicated in the scheme had resigned or been terminated. The board had undergone its own renewal, with 4 new directors bringing fresh oversight perspectives. Most importantly, Wellington had survived. The Meridian Fund had been restructured under a new management team, with transparent reporting and enhanced compliance protocols. While some clients had departed during the crisis, most had stayed, impressed by our commitment to transparency and accountability. In fact, we had begun attracting new business from institutions that valued our demonstrated commitment to addressing problems directly rather than hiding them. A knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. Sarah Matthews entered, now formally, the Director of Risk Assessment, a well-deserved promotion for her role in helping rebuild Wellington's risk management infrastructure. "The quarterly risk review is ready for your approval," she said, placing a binder on my desk. "All investment products are operating within their defined parameters, and the new compliance flags are working as designed. No significant issues to report." I smiled, music to my ears. Also, the regulators have completed their review of the remediation plan. Full approval, no additional requirements. This represented the final chapter in the regulatory aftermath. Formal acknowledgement that Wellington had properly addressed the systemic issues that allowed the Meridian fraud to occur. "That calls for a celebration," I said. "Gather the team for lunch, my treat." As Sarah left, my direct line rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized. Morris and Fitch, one of the country's largest financial services recruitment firms. "Thomas Greene," I answered. "Tom, it's Vivian Morris. How are things at Wellington these days?" Vivian was legendary in the industry for placing top executives. We had met occasionally at financial conferences over the years. "Steadily improving," I replied. "What can I do for you, Vivian?" "I'll be direct. First Atlantic Bank is looking for a new CEO, someone with impeccable integrity, crisis management experience, and the ability to rebuild trust. Your handling of the Wellington situation has made quite an impression. Would you be interested in discussing the opportunity?" The offer took me by surprise. First Atlantic was several times larger than Wellington, a prestigious institution with a national footprint. The CEO role would represent a significant leap. "I'm flattered," I said carefully, "but I've made commitments here. Wellington is still rebuilding." "I understand loyalty," Vivian responded, "but consider this. You've successfully guided Wellington through its crisis. The systems you've implemented are working. Perhaps your next challenge lies elsewhere. Take my card at least. The board chairman would very much like to speak with you directly." After hanging up, I sat with the unexpected proposition. 6 months ago, I had been unceremoniously dismissed, my 25 years of service seemingly counting for nothing. Now I was being courted for one of the most prestigious positions in the industry, precisely because of how I had handled that dismissal and its aftermath. Later that day, I had my regular monthly meeting with Janet Hargrove. These sessions had evolved from crisis management to strategic planning as Wellington stabilized. "I hear the regulators have signed off on our remediation plan," Janet said as we settled in her office. "That's the final hurdle cleared." "A significant milestone," I agreed. "The team has done remarkable work." Janet studied me thoughtfully. "You seem preoccupied today, Thomas. Something on your mind?" I hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I received a call from a recruitment firm. First Atlantic is looking for a CEO. They're interested in discussing the role with me." Janet's expression remained calm, though I detected a flicker of concern. "That's not surprising. Your handling of our situation has been noticed throughout the industry. Are you considering it?" "I'm committed to Wellington," I said. "We've come through the crisis, but there's still work to be done. There will always be work to be done, Janet replied, but don't dismiss the opportunity out of hand. You've more than fulfilled your commitment here. Wellington is stable, the new systems are functioning, and your team is strong. Her generosity surprised me. Many board chairs would react defensively to the potential loss of a key executive. Think about what you really want for your next chapter, she continued. You've earned the right to choose your path forward. That evening, I shared the conversation with Linda over dinner. We sat on our back porch, the same spot where we had discussed my termination 6 months earlier. First Atlantic, she mused. That would mean relocation to Boston. Most likely, I agreed. A significant change after 30 years in Philadelphia. Linda set down her glass, considering. Change isn't always bad. Our daughters are established in their own lives. We've talked about wanting new experiences as we approach retirement. You'd be willing to move? For the right reason, yes. She smiled. The question is whether this is the right opportunity for you, not just professionally but personally. You've spent the last 6 months fixing someone else's mistakes. Maybe it's time to build something of your own design. Her perspective, as always, cut through my uncertainty. The Wellington crisis had consumed me completely. The detective work to uncover the fraud, the urgent efforts to contain the damage, the painstaking reconstruction of systems and trust. I had approached it as a duty, a responsibility to an institution I had helped build. But now that duty was largely fulfilled. I think I'll take the meeting, I said finally, just to explore the possibility. 2 weeks later, after preliminary discussions with First Atlantic's board, I sat in Janet's office with a formal resignation letter. The decision hadn't been easy, but it felt right. First Atlantic offered the opportunity to implement from the beginning the governance and risk management principles I had spent a career refining. I was hoping you might change your mind, Janet said, accepting the letter. But I understand the attraction of a fresh challenge. Wellington is in good hands, I assured her. Sarah is ready to step up, and the systems we've put in place are solid. Janet smiled. It's ironic, isn't it? Richard fired you to protect his scheme and install his nephew. That single action not only led to his downfall, but elevated you to heights he never achieved. There's a lesson there about unintended consequences. I agreed, and about overlooking crucial details, Janet added. If he had bothered to read your original contract properly, none of this might have come to light. We both knew that wasn't entirely true. The Meridian fraud would likely have been discovered eventually through regulatory examination or financial inconsistencies. But that overlooked clause had accelerated the process, creating the opportunity for me to address the situation before more damage occurred. On my final day at Wellington, I cleared my desk methodically, much as I had done 6 months earlier. But the circumstances could not have been more different. Instead of being escorted out by HR, I was honored with a reception attended by the entire staff. The board presented me with a crystal memento engraved with a simple message: integrity, when it mattered most. Sarah would be assuming many of my responsibilities, with a promotion to senior vice president already approved. As we said our goodbyes, she handed me a small package. A parting gift, she explained. Open it later. At home that evening, I unwrapped the package to find a framed document, a photocopy of page 37 from my original employment contract with clause 15C highlighted in gold. Attached was a simple note in Sarah's handwriting. Sometimes the most important things are hiding in plain sight. I smiled, placing the frame on my desk beside the family photos. That overlooked clause had been the beginning of a journey I could never have anticipated. From sudden termination to uncovering fraud to institutional renewal, and now to new professional heights. Linda found me there, contemplating the framed contract. Unusual decoration, she teased. A reminder, I explained, of how small details can change everything. She slipped her arm around my shoulders, and of how doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, eventually leads where you're meant to go. As we stood together, looking out at the neighborhood, we would soon be leaving. I felt a profound sense of closure. What had begun as a professional setback had transformed into something entirely different, a reaffirmation of the values that had guided my entire career and a new beginning I hadn't imagined possible. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage. Richard had seen me as just another middle-aged executive to be discarded, failing to recognize that principles run deeper than position, that integrity creates its own power. That oversight had cost him everything while opening doors I hadn't known existed. The clause he had missed wasn't just about severance terms. It was about respect for commitments made and obligations honored. In overlooking it, he had revealed everything about his character and eventually about mine. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.